So today I'm presenting joint work together with Susanne Maas, who's actually sitting in the front row here. Thank you for the nice introduction already. I have a short accessibility note on availability of my slides. I was told that this session actually is translated into German, so it's not? Not in this room. Not in this room, oh, so then it's not even true what I'm writing. So just to make you aware of it. So I'm going to be talking in English, but I can distribute the slides after. I could make available a download link for the slides. So I'm talking about, I'm going to present today a process model for integrating gender research in computing. So why does this actually matter? What are some of the problems that arise from not integrating gender diversity expertise in computing? So like 10 or 15 years ago, I always had to justify myself. Why do you have to talk about gender diversity in computing? Nowadays, hardly a week goes by without news from press or social media channels that show that computing systems are always socio-technical systems, and therefore they rely on social structuring and classification systems that are, that shouldn't happen. So that as the example here shows, often prone to stereotyping or mirror social inequalities. So gender and intersectional categories such as race, class, disability matter in IT design and research. And in the morning today, Nicola Marston already introduced or talked a bit about how people are trying to tackle issues of gender in STEM or STEAM disciplines. So most prominently, Stanford University's Gendered Innovation Project names 3 approaches. One is fixing the numbers of women in computing, which focuses then on increasing the participation of women. Fixing the institution, which promotes gender equality in careers through structural change. And of course, the fixing the knowledge or the gendered innovations or gender dimension approach in the actual methods, procedures, and the knowledge in computing. Why am you showing this example here with the I methodology? Because the I methodology, and luckily Melanie already introduced us to the I methodology, so that I don't have to do this now, kind of combines the 2 of the fixing questions, that of the number of women or diverse teams in computing with the I methodology, with the fixing the knowledge. So the slide shown here gives an example of IT built from the I methodology. This was the Apple's Watch a couple of years ago. This is actually not really a computer science example. It's more of an electrical engineering example showing sensors who work better the lighter your skin is. And of course, this here is matched to the development team, or the CEOs of the Apple company, who are not very diverse as such. So with the rise of artificial intelligence systems, in particular machine learning and deep learning, the problematization of whose viewpoints, whose lived experiences and expertise gets actually considered when building IT systems gets even more important. I have some kind of timing here on my slides, so they change for themselves. I'm sorry about that. So if we don't factor in gender and diversity, IT systems will fail to adhere to, on the one hand, societal norms of like gender equality, inclusion, and non-discrimination. They will also reinforce, work like an echo chamber for social inequalities, and simply may not work for everyone, for diverse user groups. So if gender and diversity aspects are not integrated, we will head towards what I call like a second wave of the digital divide we were fearing or had in the 80s and in the 90s. So this was kind of my prologue, my story to tell you before I get to further content. So what kind of challenges do occur when you actually want to integrate or work interdisciplinary, make interdisciplinary work between the social humanities, gender and diversity studies in particular, and computing? And why is it so challenging? Now comes a rather complicated slide, I'm afraid, about what I call the two worlds. So one answer to this is the long-standing division between the humanities and the social sciences Western academia has evolved around, leading to a separation of what we consider being social and the technical. And this mirrors in our curricula, in how we educate young engineers, young computer scientists, because they are not educated at all, at least in Germany, or only to a very small amount, to integrate and really address social and ethical issues while actually building computational systems. Plus, gender studies and computing also differ, of course, in academic tradition. They have a very different disciplinary culture, different methods, different languages, and different approaches. My slide here, and I'm aware of that, of course, oversimplifies, but I want to point out in short that whereas gender and diversity studies emphasize and makes visible the richness of the social world and accounts for marginalized perspective in particular, computing, in order to build functioning artifacts, you need to select, determine, make sometimes rather rigid choices in order to be able to standardize, to formalize, to compute after all, because that's what computers do, they compute. So what do we need to do? We have to build sort of what is called in participatory design a third space. We have to enable interdisciplinary work. We have to build a space for knowledge transfer when it comes to terms and concepts, when it comes to methods and processes and examples. And here I want to highlight, of course, that gender research has a long history in computing. So there always have been people working in computing with gender studies approaches. And a couple of, what I say, the German people who have been very influential in the field you will meet at this conference or who are already here at this conference. So now I come to the actual approach to the process model. So how are we, or is our work here contributing to making IT work? And the title of our paper, Making IT Work, is actually like a double, it has a double meaning. It means making this interdisciplinary space possible, having people from the social sciences and the computer science departments work together, but also in the end build better IT systems. So the approach I present in the following seeks to operationalize gender and diversity expertise for computing by the means of a process model. The idea in fleshing out of this approach was done in an interdisciplinary research project between gender studies and computing. It was called Inform Attraktiv at the University of Bremen. So what I'm presenting is collaborative work by Susanne Maas, who's here today, but also by my former colleague Camilla Weider. So how did we actually go about in building the model? In the following, I will briefly sketch out how we approached the model building, and this hopefully will also give you insight into what the model actually consists of and how you could work with the model. So what we did. In the beginning of the GERD model, we actually built a cycle of core phases relevant for computing, research, and development. we identified those core phases through reviewing existing approaches in computing, and we started with software engineering process models, because they are that's what people in software engineering work with. So we reviewed models like the V model, the waterfall model, and we also took into consideration more agile approaches. We also looked at user-centered standards and at ISO norms, for example. And because we also wanted to factor in actually the research in computing, we also looked at a variation of how research activities go about in computing, and we also looked at the social sciences for this. How are, for example, projects thought of? In the end, we found that, of course, these approaches all are very different, have a very different sort of tradition and background, and the details were very different. Nevertheless, we were able to combine these, extract like the gist of the different models and put them into our model, which you can see here on the right with the phases. We added one phase, the first one, impulse and motivation, ourselves, because we found that that is the phase that always happens when you define a project or when you think about a product you want to develop, but it's actually not made visible as such. So the phases you can see here, I think the other phases probably are familiar with you if you're working in research and development. So in the beginning, you have a project definition phase, you go through analysis, you go through a phase then where you actually build the concept or the model, you realize it, you have an evaluation period, you do testings, and then you disseminate. And of course, I know this is rather a linear cycle, but when you're actually working, you always go back and forth between the different phases. So this is actually the computer science, computer and social science overall approach. But then we also wanted to bring in, of course, gender and diversity knowledge into our model. And for this, we simultaneously to the aforementioned process, we reviewed literature, talks, and guidelines from gender and diversity studies, and extracted and identified sort of key concepts. These key concepts then were called, or are called in the model I'm presenting, reflection aspects. And here are just a few mentions, like, for example, work culture, power relation, values, benefits, and relevance. So the next slide shows you an overview of the framing of the core phases with the reflection aspects. So the reflection aspects are here depicted as sort of the social frame that always already informs technological development. The reflection aspects you see here are not assigned to a particular phase, but they inform and influence activities in all phases of the process. So the actual model then consists of the core phases you see in the middle, and we also, you can see the little points we made kind of sub-processes or sub-tasks that you do in each phase. And the reflection aspects you see, and we also have guiding questions and examples. So I hope I have not lost everyone already with the project. I think how you can work with it will maybe become, or hopefully become, a bit clearer in the next slide, because this one shows not the questions yet or how to work with it. So how do you work or go about working with the GERD model? So our hypothesis is, or our belief was, that in software design, only those requirements and affordances that have been perceived and understood can subsequently be considered for implementation. So only what has become aware, reflected upon, made visible, can then inform the actual research and development process. So our model draws attention to requirements that are often overlooked, for example, marginalized user groups, and it aims at preserving those overlooked interests throughout the whole design circle. So it motivates then from the early planning stages to take up these reflection aspects, and because you cannot work with if you just tell people you have to reflect on knowledge, that's probably will not help them. So we came up with questions, with sort of a guiding questions catalog, where you can ask when you are at the specific stage in your project. You can go to the project definition. You can then click. I will show you. We have a website. I will just show the link to the website later. You can then go and the questions sort of pop up, or there's a guiding catalog of questions to ask for examples. And because the questions as such are still sort of rather abstract, the whole GERD model also works with examples. So it introduces, for example, we had this key issue of work culture, but it also introduces, through examples from gender and diversity studies, key concepts like the notion of invisible work. For example, it's changing again. The example of invisible work, to acknowledge work that is overlooked. And when work processes that are overlooked, you cannot model again, and they cannot inform the research project. There's actually one pretty good example of the invisible work from my former alma mater, from the University of Bremen, where a smart house was built for the researchers to work in. And the researchers working there had a web interface to interact with the building. So you could turn on the heating, you could adjust the lights, you could pull down the slides and pull them up. So everything was sort of automated through this web interface, but what was actually forgotten in the design process were the people that would come and clean the building, and they would come and clean the building during the night. And so the system had to be readjusted to accommodate people cleaning the building in the night, because in the beginning it was not possible for the workforce, the cleaning workforce, to interact with the system, because it was a web dialogue which was catered and made and manufactured for us researchers there. So they could only work with a very limited lighting, limited heating during the night. So this is one example to sort of flesh out this rather more abstract GERD model and make relevant how the reflection aspects, or the key aspects derived from gender and diversity studies, actually inform the process, or why are they relevant. And we have a couple of examples. I think I still have 5 minutes, or not really? Okay. So I think I can maybe close like this, or with my last slide, and show you some. I have to think about like really short and smart closing remarks. So maybe, to sum up, research in fields such, as I said, such as the social sciences, gender and diversity studies, feminist science and technology studies, or critical theory often have more of a commentary, analytical and reflective perspective on technological development. These studies and this knowledge from these fields is, however, super important, but there's often a lack of translation between the fields. So what we are trying to do with the GERD model is find this sort of missing link to translate and connect fields that are otherwise not as easily connected. So the GERD model basically is meant as a tool for translation, to highlight interdisciplinary work, and of course it's by no means meant as a substitute for interdisciplinary work projects. So, and I often get asked, but is GERD actually in action? Is it applied? So I put some of the places that I know of that already work with the GERD model and some of my own research projects on the slide. We also have a website hosted by Susanne Maas in Bremen at the moment. It's currently in German only. There are sort of plans to maybe build a more accessible card set to make GERD easier and more playful to interact with. And I think I should just stop here with my talk. Thank you.